Hello, I'm Sandra Gilman, Chairman of the American Theater Wing, with our board president, Doug Leeds. Welcome to today's program. Working in the theater brings together everyone, from performers and directors to playwrights and producers. It gives all of us a rare opportunity to see the people who create theater engage in conversation with one another.
With more than 850 guests during the 30 years that these programs have been on the air, working in the theater allows all of us to hear from the people behind the characters, the stories, and the productions that draws each of us to the theater.
We hope you'll enjoy today's edition as we share yet another unprecedented forum for a meeting of theatrical minds.
And we'll be back later to tell you more about the work of the American Theater Wing. But right now, please join us for Working in the Theater.
For all the work you see on stage, there is a great deal of work behind the scenes in producers' offices across the country. Hello, I'm Gordon Cox from Variety for the American Theater Wing, and joining me are four of the theater's top producers: Roger Berlind, Margo Lion, Jeffrey Richards, and Jeffrey Seller. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gordon.
It's common these days to hear theater people worry about the increasing commercialization of Broadway. And so just to begin, I just wanted to ask you, as producers, do producers produce out of passion for an artistic project or out of commercial conviction these days?
First of all, I find that hard to believe, because if you go back in time to the age of the Ziegfeld Follies, where could you find more commercialization than back when they created the New Amsterdam Theater in 1915. The commercialization of Broadway is embedded in the nature of Broadway. So I don't worry about the commercialization of Broadway. Do you, Roger?
That's what we're in business for.
Well, you know, there's that great Woody Allen quote: if it were, if it were all about art, it would be show art and not show business. Right. So I think that's, we have to. It's a business, right. Commerce.
But I think it's also very exciting when the unexpected becomes commercial, and just as it's at the other direction, it becomes exciting, unfortunately, when what you think is surefire commercially doesn't work. So, I mean, and you've been there, Jeffrey, certainly when you've had Avenue Q or Rent, those are unexpected. On the other hand, I think something like Hairspray, though it may not have initially been unexpected, Margo, it was perceived as something that really had extraordinary commercial possibilities at the beginning.
Yeah, but only once people heard it. I mean, it wasn't as an idea conceived that way. And I actually don't think any really outstanding work gets done that's originated by a producer or picked up by a producer unless it comes from a place of passion. I think second guessing doesn't work. I think if there's that great story of a producer years ago who went out and surveyed all these people in New Jersey to find out what it was that made the perfect musical. And I think it was a mystery, and it was a love story mystery. And she put everything together, and it didn't work. You can't do it that way. It has to. I always think that a show to work, somebody writing that show or producing it or something, preferably writing it, has to write that show. There's coming from someplace inside them that is very, very deep, with something they have to express. In the case of Hairspray, I actually did it because I thought it would have good stock and amateur rights. I had no idea that I was going to do it at New York Theater Workshop, following these guys. Right. And I thought it would be a sort of comedic, notion, but not like Rent, but I mean for that kind of audience. That's what I thought.
Stock and amateur will have to wait.
Stock and amateur will have to wait. That's true.
How do you balance, though? Because you do have to think like business people, and yet you also have to have a passion for a project. How do you balance those two sides of your brain?
I want to go back a little bit in time for me, because I started as a booker, where my job was to take shows and book them in all of the primary and secondary markets across America. And sometimes those shows were easy shows because they had already won the Tony Award, like crazy for you, for example. But sometimes we would literally, back in the late 80s and early 90s, have to think up revivals for the road because New York wasn't producing enough new musicals. So back then, we would literally just put on our commercial hat and say, what is going to sell well on the subscription series in Columbus? And I remember one year literally saying, Sound of Music hasn't been on the road in a long time, maybe a decade, and Marie Osmond sounds like she'll go great in that. That's putting on the commercial hat, and it fills a niche because you already know you've sold 10,000 tickets in Columbus before you've even opened the door. That is a completely separate activity, I think, from what we do as producers when we make a new Broadway musical.
Right.
For me, when I was contemplating doing Rent, number one, I didn't anticipate we would go to Broadway, and number two is I just loved it. Mm-hmm. I had to do it because I loved it. And I never thought about who would come to see it, because I just figured if I like it, hopefully other people will like it too. And the only person I can ultimately try to please is myself.
Yes, I think
Jeffrey,
that's what
do you agree with
that's
me?
absolutely true.
I think all of us start with that. We are turned on intellectually or emotionally, or something grabs our funny bone, and we just have to make that happen. And the economic consequences, if we then sit down and say, how can we make this work? Is it possible to not lose a lot of money for everybody if we do it wrong? And then we have a responsibility to make that vision or that passion turn into commercial success. And that's a difficult thing to accomplish.
I
all
don't
the
think
time.
anybody produces unless they really believe in what they're producing, 100%, all the way down the line. And sometimes you have as much affection for the play or musical that you do that doesn't succeed, as the ones that do succeed. We've all been there.
I think probably.
Roger and I, when you asked that question earlier, we worked on a show a couple of years ago that we produced together called The Cane Mutiny Court Martial. And in actuality, I had met with the playwright Herman Wouk 2 years before, and if anything seemed like it would be a commercial success or had the earmarks of a potential commercial success, it was that show. When I met with Herman, 12 Angry Men had not been done on Broadway, and I secured the rights. There hadn't been a courtroom drama done in a long time. I felt it had enormous appeal. We all did, and we loved it. But when you say that seemed like a very good commercial bet, and it turned out not to be.
Yeah, I just don't think you can second guess it. I say that again. I mean, that's the great thing about the theater. It's a surprise. I mean, you just don't know. I mean, it's such alchemy to make the thing work. I mean, you can have a collaboration that has been very successful for years and years and years, had many hits, put them together, yet again, it doesn't work. You can have a collaboration of people who don't know each other at all at the beginning, and magic happens. So you just don't know. And the timing also. I mean, I think if Hairspray had been done, 5 years before, it probably wouldn't have been the success it was. I think it's so much of it has to do with things that you can't predetermine. And that's why you have to have the passion for it.
And so tell me, before we get too far in this discussion, actually, I think a lot of people who aren't as familiar with the business side of the theater don't quite know what producing is. Like, what is it? What do you guys do with your days every day? How does a producer produce a show?
If I knew, I'd be very successful.
Well, there are all kinds of
right. Tell me about that.
Ways that you can define producing. I mean, one is you see something in a not-for-profit theater, you think it's great, it got great reviews, you pick it up, you move it, and your job there really is to raise money and to market and sell the show, and to make any changes, cast changes or material changes that you feel are necessary. That's fun. That's not the kind that I particularly love, but that's okay. Then there are times when artists can come to you with a project, and you say, yes, I'd like to do this, and you put together the team, and then for me, the most fun is sitting in your room and coming up with an idea and then moving ahead on it.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the most satisfying thing is to be the motivating force that makes a show happen, because you have an idea and you want to put it together, and you hire a writer, hire a director, and it's an arduous and much more difficult way to go and takes much more time, but if it works, you feel you've really done something creative. as well as having
That's the way the
some
theater
economic
used to be
consequence,
when they used to produce, up until, I think everything changed in 1968. There was a watershed moment, and that was when The Great White Hope came to Broadway, and Arena Stage came to Broadway, and for the first time, it took a few years after that, but the resident theaters in this country became, directions in which commercial theater presenters would go. But I don't think up until then, and that ignited something. And producers who used to conceive projects and go to writers, that was a moment where I think it changed for all of us.
Except there's so many examples. Margo Lion started Hairspray, had the idea of doing it, hired the people to put it together. It's a producer-driven hit. And
But that's very infrequent. I mean, Jeffrey does it when he does shows like In the Heights and Avenue Q and Rent. But it used to be that every year there were 25 or 30 productions that actually originated on Broadway with Broadway producers at the helm, and that did not come from theaters around the country. I think this is very healthy, by the way, but I also wish there was more inspiration.
Well, I think that has to
Broadway.
do with the economics, a lot of it, because things are so much more expensive. And also, I think, theater hasn't been quite in the mainstream as it was in the 40s, 50s, even maybe in the 60s. I think what's very heartening to me is the number of young people who, we were seeing this great drain going to Hollywood, and I think now there are a lot of young people who are interested in producing, interested in writing for the theater, and it's very exciting, I think, So maybe we'll have more of that producer-driven.
I recently decided that I had to bring down to 4 steps the life of the producer and how we go through a show. So this is what I came up with. Pick the show, which is our aesthetic expression. Okay, our ability to express ourselves, for the most part, happens with what material do we choose to do.
That's right.
And in my case, if you actually look at Rent, Avenue Q, and In the Heights, there is a through line that goes through all of them. They're all contemporary. They all take place in New York City. In the case of Avenue Q and Rent, they're all about young people trying to realize their dreams. To some degree, that influence is In the Heights as well. We pick the play. We put together the creative team. It's very hard to sometimes answer that question to people when we say, well, we didn't write the play, I didn't direct the play, I'm not acting in the play. So what do you do? Because after we put all those people in the room together, our job is cheerleader, critic, motivator, disciplinarian sometimes.
Yeah, how hands-on are producers in terms of the creative development?
Yeah, it depends.
Some more than others.
Tread lightly is, my rule of thumb. And don't
But you're very involved.
Very involved, but if a producer gets too into the trees, they're not going to see the forest.
Yes, I think
You
that's
have
exactly
to trust
right.
the artists that you've made a commitment to. I think that's very important, but you also have to realize, if something is not going in the right direction. Sometimes it's not correctable.
But you're also running a business. It's like a startup in any area of activity. You have all the problems that any other business has. You have to have a capital budget, an operating budget. You hire press, you hire an advertising agency, you have attorneys, you have contracts to deal with. And then, when the show is open, you have a business to run and to maximize the value of that business. And that's a continuous job. It involves frequent and painful advertising meetings, but you have to monitor every area of activity in a show. It's not as glamorous or as much fun as getting to opening night.
Right.
And that's what I call number 3, which is sell it.
That's right.
And sell it for me is from the beginning, whether it's selling it to an author to try to come on board to work on the show, and then selling it to our investors. Then we have to go out there.
And what Roger is saying, that with the business part of it, you do have a major obligation to your investors, because if you don't return monies, it's going to be very difficult to reapproach them.
Right.
Of course, you could have 9 flops in a row, and you could say, I have this idea about Tom Hanks reading the telephone directory, and you'd have no problem raising money.
Speaking of raising money, who invests? Where do you get your investors? Who do you call when that?
People who can afford to lose it. People in companies. I mean, everybody has their own way of raising money, but certainly there are entertainment companies that have interests, whether they own the underlying rights, like movie studios, or used to be recording studios, but that doesn't really happen anymore. But maybe some industry that has, or corporation that has a kind of secondary interest in it. Also, individuals who really can take a flyer. And I always say to people, look, I think this is great. I think it's going to be a big hit, but you know what? Nothing is guaranteed. 20% of them return their money. If you can't lose it, don't do it. But I'm really excited about it. And that's the way I raise money. Other people don't ever discuss the downside, but I feel uncomfortable doing that. So,
The disclosure section of an offering document spells out every possible thing that can go wrong.
Yeah, but they don't read those. Their accountants read it.
Right. It's scarier than the scariest horror film if you look at it.
And it's 1 in 5 that recoups. That's the statistic.
But it's about the passion of the person selling it. It's like any business. You can, if you're passionate about it and people believe it, and they want to put money in the theater, they're going to put money in the theater. I think that's what it is. You're selling yourself really as much as an idea.
I think every producer has a different record, and shows vary. Every show is a new entity, and it could make it or not based on a variety of factors that you can't anticipate. But I think it's a good business. And I think you can have a very successful career producing if you keep your wits about you.
You never know what will strike the imagination of the audience. There is something that can come completely out of the blue, and you capture lightning in a bottle in that one moment, and it may not even be that good.
But it isn't just the audience. It's also, as I said, the timing of the moment.
Yes.
Look at something like Angels in America, which is, it's a great play. But it just caught it was a perfect time. So it was, an astounding piece of writing that was supported by the press, that revealed something, critical, created a kind of discussion in the culture that was critical at the moment. And it worked, and it was commercially successful.
Yes, but it could have had the most extraordinary reception, but if audiences hadn't embraced it, if the word of mouth hadn't been very positive for it, if people hadn't gone out talking about it, it still would have had a limited engagement, because no matter what the influence of the media, it's finally the person who's going to be, putting down money and going to see the show that determines its ultimate commercial success.
Well, that's right. And I think that we would probably all agree that the thing without which you cannot have a success is a show that the show has to move an audience. In commercial theater, aesthetics are wonderful, intellectual ideas are provocative, terrific. We love to have them in the theater, but for a long-running show where you have to fill, 1,200, 1,400, 1,800 seats, whatever it is, you've got to move people right here. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And that is one of the things.
Or you have to move them with the artistry of the production.
Yeah, but the art only goes so far.
Right, but I deal a lot with limited engagements, and so we did Glengarry Glen Ross, which I thought was, I'm subjective. I thought it was a brilliant production, and I think it's a great play. But it doesn't move people the way that you're saying.
It's not sentimental moving, but it moves people. It's powerful. It's powerful emotionally.
But I'm going to challenge you on that, Jeffrey, because I was a big fan of that production, and I did find myself completely emotionally engaged with the downfall of Alan Alda's character.
Great. No, I would agree with that, but a lot of people.
But as that character, and I'm sorry I forgot the name of the character, was coming apart at the seams.
Right.
Yes, it's very moving.
It was moving.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm glad that you found that. A lot of people necessarily didn't find that, but that was, one of the strong points I felt of the production.
It's also why it was
There was a
great casting.
nice compliment to Death of a Salesman, which people did comment on, because it was, as far as I was concerned, the first half of the century had Death of a Salesman, the second half of the century had Glengarry Glen Ross.
Right.
It's interesting. That's an interesting comparison. Yeah.
I just want to go back on something Jeffrey said, because if you do look at the series of shows that people have done, it will tell you a lot about who they are. I always do shows about outsiders, forever. I've been doing shows about outsiders. And because I grew up in a situation where I was sort of an outsider. So I think that producing, a lot of people think it's just not a creative exercise. But it is. I think for people who've made a life of it.
You discover a side of yourself.
It is, and it is our way. I mean, I wanted to be an actress. You were going to be a composer, right? I don't know you were probably going to be a performer, right? I don't know about you guys, but
was gonna
we
be a
didn't make it,
journalist.
or we didn't go for that. We went for something else, but we're doing it as producers.
How do you, as a young producer, how do you get started?
I always say, don't go into, have another job unless you have a trust fund, because really you can't make, you can't, I know you can make a good living producer, but I wouldn't want to rely on it at the beginning. I mean, you need to have something else going for you. And then I think, I always encourage young people to, get to know young writers, get to know young composers, build a network. The theater is like any other business. I mean, it's a family, and these young people who come up, they have friends who write, they have friends who act, and they start with readings and very small productions, showcase productions, and that's the way you come up. So I think you start, by coming in at your age level, if you can, and seeing material that you like, going out, getting it on, getting a reading, getting people there. It's hard. I mean, the first reading, I remember when I was doing what became Jelly's Last Jam, and I was, nobody knew who I was. It was 1985, and I did, because I had a partner, Pam Koslow, who was Gregory Hines' wife, we managed to get people to come to these presentations that we gave down at 890. But the first three, nobody came. Everybody sent their, fourth assistant and, or latest intern, and it wasn't until it sort of got out that, it was sort of a fun thing to see that people came. And so you have to, you have to stick to it, and you have to.
1985 was when you had your first reading, so it took 7 years.
It took 11 years from the time I had the idea.
Which was in the 1981.
It was 1980.
Wow.
A lot of people notice, in the old days, it was David Merrick Presents, name of show. And now it's not uncommon to see 5 names, or 10, or 15, or 20.
Or 20,
it keeps going up.
35.
Or 35 names listed as producers above the title. Can you tell me a little bit about what contributes to this trend, and do you feel like it diminishes
economics?
Money.
When I was really a press agent, in 1978, a play opened called Death Trap. There were just 2 producers above the title, Roger L. Stevens and Alfred Deliagra. And the reason why is it was a $200,000 production. That's how much it cost. Today, I think that if they were doing it, it would be a $2.5 million production, and they would probably be asking people at this table to join them.
When we started, our shows were less expensive. Rent was $3.5 million, so there were only, Kevin and Alan and myself in your theater workshop. Avenue Q was exactly the same way, so we were able to keep a very small number of names above the title. It's just a function of money. And, at this point, what I try to think about in my mind is that, this is perhaps splitting hairs, but the producer of the show is the general partner. It's the person who has to write the check if you go over budget. There will be many people above the title, and it's what we have to do. But if you want to know who the producer is, it's the general partner.
It's
the
also
person who
usually
has
However,
to
there
write
are
the check.
circumstances where priority loans will be required of shows, and everybody above the title will contribute.
But if you close the show with $1 million deficit,
They don't have to, it has to be
they're,
voluntarily. Right.
stage left, exit.
Yeah, but it's also where, the truth is, there is one person, or in the case of someone like you who has a partner, 2 of you, but there is one entity where the buck stops. And I'm talking not necessarily financially, but if you can avoid that, that would be best. But creatively, what I try and do is to have a team of people that all the co-producers who have taken the risk with me feel that they can be part of the process. But finally, if I've originated the show, if it was my idea, those ideas that people have creatively come to me, and I will give them to the director, because you don't want, there are those famous stories of people, in theaters, telling that, I'm the third girl from the right, I don't like, their stockings by, their pantyhose by William, or something like that. They've got too many sparkles. You just don't want that happening. I remember, again, when I did Jelly, I got a very long letter from a major investor and above title producer, and it was very long about how inept George Wolfe was, and finally she just said, more tap, less crap. And I thought, this is just like not what I want in the theater, And she's a very nice person, Actually, it's just a great line. I sort of love it. It's a great line because it sort of encapsulates what you're dealing with when you're at those moments.
He was right.
And we put more tap in, I want to say.
Kevin and I have a joke, which is that if you want to know how much the show cost, just multiply the number of producers by $1 million on a on.
Yes.
So if there's 10 names above the title, it's a $10 million musical, and just go up from there.
That's a good equation. That's a good way to look at it.
And actually, let's talk a little bit about the spiraling production costs. What contributes? What are the factors that contribute to the costs going up?
Cost of advertising is a major factor.
And it's going up every year dramatically.
But also until
Theater rental.
until 1972 or 73, there was no commitment to do advertising on television. Pippin, I think, changed the whole face of advertising in the theater, and with that successful spot, what was it, 1 minute? And 119 minutes more if you go to the
It was
Imperial
a brilliant spot.
Theater. It was
a brilliant message.
A brilliant spot, but it saved Pippin. Pippin was doing well, but not very well. Pippin went from doing well to selling out and it played 5 years. When you do a television commercial, it can cost up to $1 million.
Yeah, but it's also labor. I mean,
for sure.
It's load-ins. Load-ins now for musicals are $1 million. Right. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, putting aside, I don't know if you guys have been going through this, but putting aside money for closing costs.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you do that every week.
Yeah, really.
That's a budget item every week.
It's incredible. It's just
But don't you find at least 25%
productions.
of your budget is advertising?
Yes, but in the production budget, I think the physical productions have really escalated, and I'm not sure the way I feel about all this, because in the end, successful theater is as much about the imagination of the audience member as it is. I mean, you want to have something that's obviously exciting and enjoyable and surprising for the audience if you can physically.
If people come out talking about the sets and the costumes and the lighting, you're in trouble.
You're in trouble. I think that's absolutely true.
I want to add something to that conversation about the money. At the end of the day, theater, like college, like healthcare, is a labor-intensive business. Any business that's driven by labor is always going to go up at a rate that's greater than the rate of inflation. It's because there are so many people, and we can't ever get scale of technology. We can never replace the people with computers, with robots, with other
handmade
machines that will make it cheaper to make it. So a television set every year, the price goes down. A computer every year, it goes down. Theater every year, it goes up, and it's all because it's labor. But you know what? I find myself not wanting to it's getting more expensive, yes. When I came to New York in 1986, you couldn't get a show capitalized. If you just look at the number of shows that were going on in that era, you could barely get 2 shows who were still running at the time of the Tonys who would be nominated for Best Musical back then. Well, here's my point, that though the costs continue to go up, more money has come into Broadway than there has in 25 years.
Why is that? Tell me.
I think Broadway has become an exciting place. It's become an exciting playground both for the audience members and for people with capital. If you look at the macroeconomic situation of this country, the amount of capital that has built up in the last 25 years is extraordinary, and there has been an enormous boon to Broadway as a result of it, which is that many people who have earned enormous amounts of money in other businesses have desired to express that money on Broadway, and there has been a lot of good as a result of it.
There's a fascination with producing in the theater and with Broadway, and at the age of 40, let's say, you can't become a rocket engineer, you can't become a physicist, you're not going to go to med school. There are a lot of professional areas that are closed to you. But if you're 40 and you've had a background in English, and you've had maybe been an English major, you've had an appreciation of the arts, and you've been going to movies, you've been going to plays, and you suddenly find that you want to explore a different avenue in your life, many people decide they want to become producers and use their capital to do that and to explore their interests in that regard.
There's ease of entry in our business. All you have to do is have a card printed.
That's right.
and you're a producer.
That's right. That's exactly right.
There's no training required. It's very helpful if you have it. It'd be very useful if you worked in a general manager's office for several years to understand the business and at it from the ground up. Or be a press agent, top press agent for many, many years, as Jeffrey was. But there are a lot of people coming in from other areas of activity who find this rewarding commercially, successfully, and artistically. They get turned on by theater.
Remember
as well they should.
The generation of the baby boomers was, I mean, beginning like in the mid to late 60s, was when the explosion happened on colleges. I mean, you know, it became automatic that people were going from high school to colleges. And I think that the influence of the arts on campuses beginning then with a whole new generation, there hadn't been that amount of individuals going to schools. They were inspired by a lot of what they read and what they saw that generation. And when they came to, you know, certain degrees of affluence, they decided that it would be great to be involved in the arts, whether it was theater, whether it was film, whether it was television, music, whatever. And they either became patrons or they became producers.
But also to go back to the money issue, I think that, you know, how much things are costing. Yeah. The thing about the theater is, it's always it's not prescriptive. I mean, we had a show this year that's up, a couple of shows that cost an enormous amount of money. That does not secure a hit. I mean, that isn't, and then it's I mean, I guess the same in film too. But the thing about the theater is you just, and as Roger says, the entry is easy. You don't know what's going to make it. You know, some newcomer who has an idea that brings some young people in who, you know, people haven't heard of, can be a huge hit. Some show that has everything going for it cannot be a huge hit. And the other thing I want to say is in a time where more and more is entertainment is electronic, is not, you know, firsthand, is not live, I think the theater is going to have a greater and greater position in the culture because it's one of the last places left where you actually can see people live, where you can see things happen that no one can predetermine, you know, and I think it's a communal experience, which I think is important. And as screens get bigger and bigger at home, you know, fewer and fewer people are going to go to movie theaters, maybe, and you know, or they're playing video games.
The other thing is an immense amount of interest in theater on campuses all over the country. I think it's been a tremendous increase in the number of theater majors or people who are engineers and take courses in theater across the country.
Is that true? I mean, I didn't even know that.
I think from my experience.
And there's also been an explosion of successful resident theaters throughout the country.
Yes.
Right.
And
there's live theater in every hamlet in this country.
Everybody wants to show off. Yeah. This is the thing. Everybody wants to be a show off. But I'd like to say here also, I think we need to give some credit to Disney, because I think a lot of these young kids, I mean, I see this now with Hairspray. I'm sure you guys see it with your shows. I don't remember this 15 years ago. Kids crowding the stage doors afterwards. It's like what I imagine 1945 was like. You know, they're all there with their autograph. They want autographs. They're excited. You know, and I think a lot of them grew up with The Lion King and Beauty and the Beast and things like this, and they're interested.
Broadway has become international and national, and you know, with that tourist base. When I was growing up, My Fair Lady became the longest running show. It played 6 years.
This year, in particular, tourism is important because of the weakness of the dollar.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we expect an enormous summer.
Yeah. Let us pray.
It'd be interesting to see how that's affected, you probably know these things, how that's affected shows, because certain shows are just not, you know, going to attract tourists. If they're text heavy, if they're plays, I think it's much harder. If they're musicals that are particularly American,
I think the long run phenomenon, because I like to work particularly in the arena of plays, is we need more theaters, because theaters that used to be, you know, solely designated, as it were, for straight plays. You know, the Belasco has Passing Strange, the Golden has Avenue Q, Brooks Atkinson has Grease. The Walter Kerr, which had Angels in America, has a catered affair. Right. These are all playhouses that were for plays, the Schoenfeld, which has, a chorus line.
I'm
One
so
of the great
impressed that you can remember all the names of these theaters.
No, but I'll
and
tell you, it
what
was an irony. In 3 years
they
ago,
changed their names so much.
when I produced Glengarry Glen Ross, and it followed Night Mother into the Jacobs Theater. And previously in 1984, Glengarry Glen Ross had followed Night Mother into the John Golden Theater, where Avenue Q was playing, and Avenue Q has been there, 5 years now, and will probably be there for another 5 years. I wish you that. But what has happened is it's diminished the ability to present straight plays on Broadway. Spring Awakening, which I'm fortunate enough to do, is with Ira Pittleman and Tom Hulse and my partner Jerry Frankel. It's at the Eugene O'Neill. That was the home for the successful revival of Death of a Salesman.
Yeah.
It's taken a straight play theater off the block.
I think what's interesting to contemplate is or challenging, what's going to be the future of straight plays on Broadway. I mean, I've always thought it should be limited runs, basically. I mean, occasionally you have an August Osage County or a Doubt or Proof, but more and more it's, a 4-month run or something like that,
Yes, you have to go all the way back to the place in the 30s, like Life with Father, which was the longest running play for a period of time. But in this era, I mean, you've had, with Proof and Doubt and Tale of the Allergist's Wife, there have been long running.
But those are set. What was that? Was Proof 2 years?
The run on Broadway,
Yeah.
just about almost 2 years,
And
and
that
then
was
a very
a-
successful tour as well.
Yeah, but that was a record breaker. I mean,
Yeah,
2
it
years
was.
for a straight play
It
is
was,
huge
absolutely.
now.
But that's always been, since the 60s, that's always been with a long run on Broadway. The Odd Couple didn't even play 2 years.
I know, but I think the economics have to change to fit the situation.
Sure.
I think you have to be able to get out in 16
Yes,
weeks.
but the quick rewards of a straight play
Yes,
are not
'cause
to be
it's-
underestimated.
Yes, I know, but you were, anyway.
But frequently you can't keep actors in the same job for more than a limited run, particularly
right.
imports from London.
But I'm going to play the devil's advocate to that. I mean,
Of
doing
course.
the 16-week straight play that can make its money back and make a modest profit is great. But none of us could pay our mortgage
No.
and pay for our families producing that.
But you're not going to be able to do that with
So
a straight
it's
play.
So my point of it is, it's a good hobby, but no, you can't make a living from it.
No.
I've thought that if you could put together a series during a year, if you were a producer and you had 4 straight plays that ran, 16 weeks or
Well,
something
Jeffrey had
like
3
that.
this
We
season.
put
Yeah.
a series together, and that was one of the unexpected surprises. The one that we thought needed the most help, needed the least help. That was
Well, that's-
August,
yeah, that's
which
so great.
was a wonderful
Miracle
surprise.
theater.
But we didn't do August. I think August just fell in love with the play. It's when you have a passion, and everything just seems to go right. And then, as I say, you capture lightning in a bottle, and it just took off. On the other hand, at the same time, I had a play this year that I particularly loved because I worked on it when I was a kid in high school at Alex Cohn's office. It's called The Homecoming. All the elements came together, terrifically. Everybody talks about the ensemble of August Osage County, deservedly because of Steppenwolf, but we had 6 actors who had never worked together before, 3 Brits, 3 Americans. They just won an award from the Drama Desk for ensemble, which they richly deserve.
Congratulations.
And the Homecoming, all the elements came together terrifically, same way. Audiences did not want that play.
Now,
So again, but if they had, I would have had a threesome this year.
let's talk a little bit about the sort of increasing relationship of Broadway to television. The uses of television in terms of there are American Idol alumni who show up on Broadway with a sort of greater frequency. There was a Grease, a reality casting show for Grease, and there's
Yeah,
an
there's
upcoming
one
one for
coming
Legally
for
Blonde.
Legally Blonde,
Exactly.
yeah.
What's the sort of impetus behind that, and what are we learning, do you think?
I'm learning that I'm over the hill and I've been around too long because I don't watch those shows, and I'm going to lose out to more adventurous young producers.
You have an expanded audience base automatically. I mean, Grease, I think, did not receive, the favorable reception they hoped they would, but they had, because of their reality show, they had an enormous advance, and audiences gravitated towards it.
I think people actually, the more familiar they are with something, the more they want to come. The movie of Hairspray gave us an entire new life.
Yes, familiarity breeds content.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think it may show something about a little bit of a lack of imagination or diminishment of imagination in the culture. I don't know, but whatever it is, the more people know about something, the more familiar they are with it, the more they want to come and see it. And I think these two, in casting, I know with Hairspray, which has been my longest running musical, you know, we did it with Wedding Singer too. You know, we went to American Idol because that brings an audience with it, and that's, as Jeffrey said, you're trying to attract.
But I think
an audience.
when Roger does something like as he did, or Proof, or when you do something like Jelly's Last Jam, or when you do something like Radio Golf, or when you do something like In the Heights, Avenue Q, or Rent, these are originals. And what I really find dismaying is, you know, the fact that the theater has become, and this is part of Disneyfication too, you know, a home to the fact of lack of originality, but the adaptation of films to stage and to musicals. It happens more and more because there's a built-in audience that knows the title,
No, I don't
Legally
think that's the
Blonde,
reason. I
or
think it's
Young
because that's where the
Frankenstein.
stories are. People have always adapted stories. They adapted plays. They, you know, they
But
adapted short stories.
not at the
Isn't it more exciting to start from scratch?
scratch. I mean, there
specifically for
hasn't
theater?
been as much a reliance on movie titles.
Not
And maybe
movie
it will
titles,
happen
but
in
let's go back
television.
and look
Maybe
at
we'll
My
have
Fair
musicals. We
Lady,
are going to
look
have a
at West
musical of
Side Story.
Happy Days. West Side Story was original. It was based on, it was
Well, it's
suggested
based on
by
Romeo and
It was
Juliet.
suggested by, it was an original book. It was suggested by Romeo and
I don't
Juliet.
like the word original because I think you always start over. I mean, I think, you know, the Hairspray is very different from the movie. Alan J. Lerner, in his autobiography, says, you know, it's hard enough to write a musical. Find a story that exists already. And I actually believe
That's
in
a
that.
shortcut. But I guess the only
But
one I
look
could
at
think of
his-
that I've done recently was Curtains. Curtains started from scratch, based on nothing at all, developed over a period of several years.
Many years.
But what we came up with was something that had never been seen before, heard before, and was not based on anything except the creativity of the team.
And that's
Rupert
what the
Holmes,
theater
John
used to be
Kander,
producing,
Fred
and the theater used to
But
be.
look at Spring Awakening. You couldn't be more creative than that.
But it's based on a play. A lot of musicals were based on books and plays
That's
at a certain time. It
But
did
that's
not
where the
come,
stories were.
Right, but they didn't come from, let's say, the proliferation this year where you look at the nominees for an organization like the Theater Critics. All the 4 musicals that are nominated are derived from films.
But that's where the stories are. People go to stories. I'm not saying that that necessarily works, and a lot of the movies don't
I think 2 of the most
lend
exciting
themselves to
shows this season
adaptation.
are not based on that. There's Passing Strange and In the Heights. Originals.
I know, but I don't. Well, I disagree. I think these are original. I think, you know, I think that the characters, the outlines of the characters, may come from another form, but the way they're expressed, interpreted, finally imagined on stage, should be different from the film version.
Well, it would
But
have
too
to
often
be,
they're
and a lot
replicas.
different, because I think the record would show that what works in one medium
That's
doesn't necessarily work in another. And you run a major risk of hurting yourself by relying on a title that doesn't work on stage. Gone with the Wind has been tried a lot, and it's now a major failure in London. Pretty good title, pretty good background, and
Book sold a lot of copies.
sold a lot of copies of the book.
Greatest, it has the highest sales, more copies than anything
Yeah, like the
except
Bible or
I
something.
think it's right
Yeah.
under the Bible.
Well,
Amazing.
I think at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter. You know, of all the musicals I've done one based on a movie and novel called High Fidelity, and of course it's my biggest flop, Roger, and lost its entire investment.
But it was really good.
And closed in 10 days. Well, I'll take the movie if it's a successful adaptation like Hairspray, and I'll take the absolutely original show like Avenue Q that was an expression of those ingenious authors.
wish there were more original musicals being written, because there are a lot of gifted young composers and lyricists out there. And I think we see with the New York Music Theater Festival that there are ideas, and they just,
Listen, I feel, Jeffrey and Roger, that it is very hard for writers to create, writers in the theater, even playwrights, to create the kind of tight, well-crafted structure that you need for a book of a musical without some underlying notion. I mean, a structure, because I just don't feel that, I don't know.
I would agree. I don't think a musical can succeed without having a strong libretto. I mean, and you know, the book writer is always most shortchanged when it comes to, he's always blamed or she's always blamed and never given the credit. And never given the credit.
Tell me about how the internet has, how you think the internet has affected Broadway, not only the business of Broadway, but also the process of it.
Well, you use that very well.
I have to say, I'm not even that interested in the internet. I mean, it as a sales tool, it's becoming more effective for us every day. The truth of it is that when we advertise, even on television, which is grossly expensive, you know, when we make a TV spot, it costs $200,000 to $400,000. In the case of In the Heights, it was $350,000. Then to buy the TV time, you're going to spend another $350,000, so you're up to $700,000. And we put the TV spot on in the metropolitan New York area, which has about 12 million people. And of those 12 million people, there are only about 1.2 million of them that would ever consider going to a Broadway musical. So it is so inefficient. It means that we are literally saying, we know that 90% of that money is going down the drain before we even start, but it's the best we've got. Now, if we can continue to use the internet to find tourists who are coming to New York City and using the different travel sites so that we can really start to target those audience members who are, those tourists who are potential audience members, then we can be more efficient and use our dollars in a much better way. Because as I also just mentioned, we do that TV commercial in New York. We're also doing it to that 1.2 million people that also represents 15% of our audience, because 65% of our audience is from out of New York, and we don't have any efficient way. So I think that our advertising tools through the internet are going to continue to get better and better every day.
Yeah, and I
all
agree
of
with
our
that.
television commercials are now on YouTube and on the internet.
But it's too expensive. I mean, one thing you learn is you don't try and sell to people who don't come to theater. You got to sell to your target audience. That's you know, I always love it. I'm sure you've all experienced this with a new show, and you have a new producer who's come in, and they said, "But this time we're going to bring in." This is what happened to me with Wedding Singer. We're going to bring in the guys at 35 years old. I said, you know, they don't go to theater. They don't, you know, their wives tell them what to go to if they go at all, you know.
High fidelity.
And yeah, same deal. Same year.
Speaking of
right?
inefficient advertising, I think the New York Times is money down the drain for the most part.
I do too. So I think the internet is going to be, you can target. You get your lists, you can target. I mean, not to bring up something political, but when you see how effectively the Obama campaign has used the internet, I mean, it has revolutionized presidential campaigns, political campaigns, and I think we are, you know, we are moving much more towards
Facebook
that.
and MySpace
1
and
million
YouTube.
contributors, right? Largely through the internet.
1,500,000.
It's extraordinary. Do you want to talk about the chat rooms?
That's my
No,
next
but
question.
Jeffrey, just one thing, Facebook and YouTube and MySpace, and they have been especially effective for Spring Awakening, and with the people who, you know, go into those areas, it's been a boon for young people coming. I'm sure that you would have probably had the same experience if Rent was opening today.
Yeah, they ultimately Rent wound up catching on with all of those things.
Yeah.
It just came a little bit later, but here we have these young people doing our job for us.
That's right.
That's a good thing.
That is
It's
good.
a really
But
great
we also,
thing.
of course, have all that chat. What do you think about that, Jeff?
What, does that has that affected your development process as the as the sort of
All that chat?
well,
No, I
the
hope
sort of
not.
the sort of I mean, how much do you pay attention to the sort of internet gossip, and does it at all?
I think I'm going to hire
affect
2
you?
people just to write positive things when I want them, and different names in the chat rooms. I think the chat rooms, unfortunately, are gaining more credibility with the core audience that knows about them.
Do you think so?
Yes,
I don't
do.
pay attention to them at all anymore.
No,
At the
I think
beginning,
with
did.
theater goers who buy, some theater goers who buy tickets.
You know, one thing
Yeah.
we haven't talked about at all is word of mouth, because in the
Yes.
end, that is the only thing that makes a show work. You know, we can spend whatever we want on television, on the internet, whatever innovative ideas we have, and you know, it's something that you really, each time out, you try and you try and say, well, it's not really true. If I just last, this much, if I just do this and I last that long, I now have a kind of position that after 70,000 or 80,000 people have seen a show, if it's not working, it's never going to work. I mean, that's really my. Now, the only exception to that is shows that are daring new shows, like Spring Awakening. I would take. I don't know how you were doing after 70 or 80,000 people saw it, but I think then a slew of Tony Awards at that point can put you into another category.
I think we were helped by the fact that the media embraced Spring Awakening, and then it took off after opening solidly, and then more spectacularly after
the Tony Awards.
The award recognition.
And I would imagine I always comforted myself with the Avenue Q stories of that it took you a while to build.
Well, Avenue Q genuinely opened on the 1st of August of its year, and it did 70% business at the John Golden Theater, which only has 796 seats, for the next 10 months.
Yeah.
And we didn't have a TV commercial. We didn't know how to advertise. And I thought, we're just going to have to be patient and be brave and let word of mouth catch on. And we genuinely did 70% business. We chose not to go to the booth.
Tony.
And then we won the Tony, and then we were selling out.
And word of mouth.
It took
how
that
do you
show 2
define
months.
word of mouth? Who knows what that is? Every show I know says, here's that word of mouth is really good, and that's going to save us. Every show. And because the creative people and the producers believe in it. That's why they did it in the first place.
Yeah, but you see it at the box office, Roger.
Well, you see they're either coming or they're not coming.
That's right.
But word of mouth is indefinable.
But that's what makes them come.
You have to have enough people who have seen it.
And are moved by it.
That's
as
right,
also
and that's
the
what I always say,
visitors.
70 to 100,000 people. Then after
Well,
they've
that's a good
seen,
number, okay.
Yeah.
But
I
a lot
don't-
of shows would just be happy to get 70,000 people, period.
well, I know, but if it's not breaking, if you're not making money after that, I think there's something, they're telling you something, unless you get a slew of awards that you didn't expect. But I can remember when Curtains opened, for example, saying to Daryl, and I probably said it to you, this is going to have a nice run, because it was very pleasing to people who go to theater
Yeah.
regularly.
Whatever it is, whatever word of mouth is, that's why Curtains are still running.
That's right.
By the same token, I mean, last year's most acclaimed revival was Journey's End. And they could not find an audience because I think the subject matter ultimately didn't appeal to people. The people who went to see it genuinely liked it. But I do think that, however, that word of mouth is conveyed is very important. They probably
but then
talked
they
about
said,
it
oh my
that
God, it's really terrific, but God, I felt like hell when I got out of there. I mean, it was so moving, but it made
a
me feel
wonderful
so
production.
depressed.
It was a
that's what I think people
wonderful
were
production.
saying. I loved it.
Well,
I loved it.
I thought it's wonderful. But,
I did too. I thought it was fantastic.
And it moved you.
It did,
And
but
all the things we say we need to make
Yes.
theater work, that show had. And
But
there's no but. Word of mouth didn't happen because
happen.
people prefer something less difficult to deal with.
Going forward, what do you think are the major issues that face theater producers as you plan to produce Broadway shows into the future?
I only have one.
well, you
What is
were.
it?
Real estate. It's harder than ever.
Yeah.
It's harder to
quite
get a
right.
theater. It's harder to make a
Absolutely.
deal, and the deals are getting harder.
And quality.
But that's in our control.
No,
Yes,
yeah,
So
that's
sorry,
I
already
take
right.
some comfort in that.
I think
Yes.
creating the bottom line is harder and harder simply because the costs keep going up, and I don't see an end to that. And I think we've reached a point where we cannot look to higher ticket prices to make up that difference. And I think that the industry has always been in peril. It just continues to be in peril, and will always be in peril.
Back in
But
1950,
making that bottom line is very difficult. And in fact, if you look at these past couple of seasons, we have roughly the same amount of revenue this year as last year, maybe slightly lower overall on Broadway. If you eliminate the three monster hits, Wicked, Jersey Boys, Lion King, that tells us that what's left is roughly, that's also roughly the same because those three have just sold out all the way. Costs we know have gone up, and so somewhere that bottom line isn't working for all those other shows. And we have our own personal shows that we know about, but I think as an industry, turning a profit is getting harder and harder.
And just one last thing, I think because it's getting harder and harder, we get back to the creative side of things, which is it may tend to make producers more cautious, which means that they will go with more brand names, which means that we may not have as exciting work as we would like to have, although we will keep trying to.
However, I don't think the hit to flop ratio has changed that much over the decades. It's remained pretty constant. And I was going to say, like, there was a song from a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, Me and Juliet, in the early 50s called "The Theater is Dying, the Theater is Dying, the Theater is practically dead." Right. And every year, or every decade, you hear that lament, and the theater continues to survive, and I think continues to grow throughout the country. And as Margo said earlier about the relationship of the fact that it is, a personal and live experience, it will continue to be here, and it'll continue to have doomsayers for the next 100 years. Right. We'll all be around, of course.
I think that's a great place to end. Thanks for joining us. And thank you for joining us. These programs are brought to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in partnership with our friends at CUNY TV. On behalf of the American Theater Wing, I'm Gordon Cox, and thanks for joining us for another edition of Working in the Theater.
The American Theater Wing has played a vital role in New York's theatrical life for more than 60 years. We stand for excellence, and we support education in the theater.
Best known for creating the Tony Award, our work reaches beyond Broadway and New York.
These seminar programs, which are supported by the Annenberg Foundation and the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, are an unequal forum for discussions with today's most creative artists.
Downstage Center's in-depth interviews are heard on XM satellite radio. Our grant and scholarship programs support New York theater companies and theater students. And since we began, we have given away more than $2.5 million.
Our theater intern group helps young people who are just starting in their careers build a professional network.
And Springboard NYC is a 2-week boot camp for aspiring actors from colleges across the country.
All of the American Theater Wing's educational and media programs are available for free, on demand, from our website, americantheaterwing.org.